straight into it because we don't have a lot of time. And the more I wrote the talk, the more words ended up on the page, and there's going to be a lot to cover. All right. So, okay, like what Pastor Andy said, the theme, right, centers around First Samuel chapter 17. Right, it's one of the more known passages in the Bible, one of the more known accounts in the Bible. Right, even most children who have gone to Sunday school would know David and Goliath. Right, the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was this giant, and David managed to use a sling. He held 5 stones, but all it took him was 1 to kill Goliath. Right, and because of that, the children of Israel won the battle against the Philistines. Right, so before I dive into the focus, which is the theme of these 2 months, I'm just going to read. I'm just going to zoom in to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 19. Right, and so I'm not going to focus on the fight because I think a lot of people know that, and that's not the focus of the theme anyway. Right, we're going to focus on what happens leading up to the fight. Now, in verse 19, it says, "Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper." So David was a shepherd. He looked after some sheep. Right, he left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse, his father, had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. Right, so the Philistines, which is the enemy of the Israelites, they formed up and they were ready to fight. So you can imagine it's a time of war and there's a lot of stuff going on. Right, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the men, fled from him and were sore afraid. Right, and the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel he has come up. And it shall be that the man who kills him, Goliath, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." So promising rewards for killing this giant. Okay, that was challenging Israel. Right, and David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, "What shall be done?" So this is what David said. "What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, or Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Right, so you got to imagine that scene. Right, David, a little shepherd boy, right, turned up amongst a bunch of soldiers, right, and said, "Who on earth is this guy? How dare he challenge the armies of the living God?" I would imagine it would have sounded something like that. Right, and the people answered him after this manner, saying, "So it shall be done to the man that killeth him." Right, so setting the scene, David came from looking after a sheep. He turned up to the camp, the forward operating base, if you would, stood amongst the soldiers and asked, "Who is this audacious guy, right, that challenges the armies of the living God?" Right, verse 28, "And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David." So his oldest brother was there, perhaps wearing his armor and carrying his shield and all that, right? And he said, "Why camest thou down hither? Why have you come here? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle." Right, so I just want to focus on this passage, right, because this forms the core of what the next 2 months is going to be like, right, for the theme, right, because it centers around the accusation that Eliab gave to David. I'm just going to paraphrase, "Why have you come here?" Right, and who have you left your few sheep with in the wilderness? Right, "I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for you have come here that you might see the battle." All right, so again, setting the scene, right? Israel and the Philistines, they formed up to fight, and Goliath challenged Israel. And David, a shepherd boy, probably never fought in a battle with armor and swords and all that stuff, right? He left the sheep, right, with someone to take care of them, right? He went to the front line, he heard Goliath's challenge again, right? And he asked that question, maybe in anger, right? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that dares to defy the armies of the living God? right? So let's zoom in into how Eliab accused him, right? The first thing he said is, "Why have you come here?" Right? If you zoom in, you could see he accuses David of being out of line, right? It's not really a question, "Oh, why are you here?" It's, it's almost rhetorical. It's an accusation, right? What place do you have coming here, right? For what purpose? What purpose could you possibly have for you to be here, right? He insinuates that his presence, that David being there, is unjustified. What business do you have here? He's implying that David doesn't belong here, right? He said, "With whom have you left your few sheep in the wilderness?" Right? If you really zoom in into the words, he's almost diminishing David's stature, right? As if to imply, even a few sheep, you also can't take care of them, right? He accuses David of slacking off his responsibilities, right? It's as if to say, you only had such a small job and you couldn't even do your small job, right? Implying really that you're irresponsible, and two, that you've abandoned your duties, right? "I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart." So it looks like he's not even pointing out something that's observable. He's actually making a judgment of David's intent and his heart, right? Right. The Hebrew word for the word pride, right? I'm not sure if this is the right pronunciation, but zodon, right? In Hebrew, it implies arrogance, presumptuousness, usually associated with someone that wants to puff himself up, make himself look better than what he is, right? Saying that he has ulterior motives and selfish motives, right? So he's pointing fingers at David's heart. He doesn't know David's heart, but he still says it anyway, right? And the last part, it says, "For you have come down, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle," right? Implying that you're just here for the show, right? You don't even want to do your own job, but you come here just to see some fighting, right? And so notice how Eliab's, right, his accusation went from "you did this," right, "you abandoned your sheep," to "this is what your heart and motive is." So there's a lot of prejudice. It completely prejudged David, right? Now, if we look at David's response in verse 29, and David said, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" Right? So that was David's response, right? David's response is a little interesting, right? Because I wanted to understand what his response actually meant, right? And the issue here is that, the Old Testament was in various languages, not including English, right? And the King James Version that we have was translated from Hebrew to English, right, in 1611. So, and all the other translations that came out then, they all differ to us to a certain extent, right? And so sometimes it's useful to then go back into the original concordance to try and understand it, right? But looking at the various translations, right, it didn't really cast that much light until I went into the original Hebrew, right? For example, King James Version says, "What have I now done?" David said, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" Okay, let's skip that for now, right? In the NKJV, it says, "What have I now done? Was it not but a word?" Right, the ESV, "What have I now done?" Or "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" Right, and the AMP, right, "What have I done now? Was it not just a question?" Right, so if you look at the alternate translations, it suggests that David was defending himself, right? As if, when David came, he said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" And then Eliab goes on and rails against him, right? And it seems to suggest that all the responses given by David was to defend himself, saying that, "I cannot ask this question, man. I only just ask, who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" Right? "Why you say me until like that?" Right? But if you look into the original Hebrew, right, that it doesn't actually suggest that interpretation becomes quite out of place, right? Because the word that was used for cause or word, right, is the original word in Hebrew is pronounced davar, right? The problem here, and I can understand why the translators, can get confused, right, is because the word davar actually means, it could be meant as word, but depending on the context, right, davar can actually mean a matter, an issue, a thing, right? When a person speaks something, right, it uses the same word. When a person raises an issue in court or defends himself over a matter in court, that same word is also used, right? And so could it be that instead of David defending himself, saying that, did I not just ask a simple question? Why is it that you must, say me into like that? Right. A different way that can be looked at, which is still consistent with the original language or Hebrew, is David did not just say, did I not just raise a question? Right. He could have also meant, right, is this not a legitimate issue or matter that we should be addressing? Right. So if we look at it in that manner and we interpret it the way King James Version looks at it, right? So you've got Eliab that says, why are you here? What purpose are you here? Do you have ulterior motives? And then David said, wait a minute. When King David said, what have I now done? Right? Is this not a legitimate matter that we should be discussing? Right? Because, and this legitimate matter, right, is that Goliath just challenged the glory of God, or challenged the armies of the living God. And David, you can imagine him sitting there saying that, wait a minute, this is a real thing that we need to discuss or to respond to, right? Which is Goliath challenging the armies of the living God, right? Is there not a cause for us to respond, right? If you look at the King James Version, right? And so the point that I like to pull up from this example, right? And if you realize I haven't given a title or anything yet, right? The issue that I want to focus on in this talk, right, is that Eliab and David, right, the difference here in the way that they've approached Goliath, which is everyone can see Goliath challenge the armies of the living God, right? But the reason why they both responded so differently, right, is because of framing, right? Framing, right, is the way that you perceive something, right? Is the way that you perceive an issue or a problem or the environment, which ultimately shapes how you interpret the stuff that you see, and it sort of determines how you respond to the problem or the issue or the environment that you face, right? And so if I were to give a title to this talk, it would be called Framing, right? And over this talk, which is going to be still quite some time, right, I'm going to go into a couple of different examples and how we'll uncover that in the Bible, a lot of the good outcomes and a lot of the bad outcomes really all boils down to the framing of the people that led to those outcomes, right? And so in this case, David's frame, right, is his focus was, we're all here ultimately for God's glory, right? We need to respond to this challenge to God's glory, right? Regardless of whether you're a soldier, I'm a soldier, or a shepherd boy, or anything, right? Because ultimately we are all here for God's glory, right? And so David's frame was, whether it's an issue or not depends on whether God's glory is being challenged, right? And I will respond accordingly, right, to defend, to defend the sovereignty of God, right, and his armies, right, which is what led to his question, right? On the other hand, Eliab's frame was, if you stick to your lane and do your own job, you don't gay kyang, don't step out of line. That's what we need to do, right? He had a very soldier frame, right? As long as I just do what I'm supposed to do, and don't act above my pay grade, right, and stick in line, that's what I need to do, right? He sees everything as probably a rank and file soldier, right? So again, the difference in these two frames ultimately led to the outcome of what we can see in 1 Samuel chapter 17, right? So again, framing determines how you interpret the world around you, right, and influences the decisions that you make, which determines the outcome, right? So, okay, so I'm going to share a little account, and I keep hearing this story, right? And I might have heard this in school when I was learning to be an engineer, right? But it's all about approaching a problem not with a narrow frame, right? And so that's a story that we keep hearing, right? Okay, and it's imagine an assembly line. It's a manufacturing plant, right? So you've got operators working the the manufacturing, the machines and all that. And then you've got engineers that, would have designed the machines that works with the machines and designs changes and all that. If they want to manufacture a different product, they're the ones that gets involved with updating the design and all that. Okay, so let's just set the scene, right? There was a factory that made rice cookers, right? So you imagine machines, they build rice cookers and they go on the conveyor belt and they move, and eventually those rice cookers get placed into boxes, and the boxes get rolled out into trucks, and the trucks will deliver them to the shop, right? And so the problem that they faced, right, one day, right, they realized that, there was, because machines are not perfect and they're not perfectly designed, right, some boxes would end up empty. Okay, right, and because these boxes ended up empty, they ended up in the pallets, which goes into the trucks, which goes to the shops, and the shops go, wait, we paid for 10 boxes, but one out of these 10 boxes is empty, right? And so obviously you have complaints and all that sort of stuff, right? So the owner of the manufacturing plant went to the engineers and said, hey, we've got a problem, right? Some of these boxes are turning up empty. You need to design a fix to the machines so that this problem is eliminated. So engineers, right? I'm an engineer. I can tell you, we tend to look at the problem as, everything needs a technical solution, right? So the framing for an engineer is every problem must be solved with a technical solution, or every problem has a technical solution, right? And so what the engineers ended up doing is they designed this complicated device as part of the manufacturing line, right? Cameras, weighing scales to detect the weight of the boxes, cameras to detect when the boxes would turn up, right? And if the weight was less than a certain threshold, the alarm would go off, the assembly line would stop, and an alarm would sound so that an operator would walk up to it and move the box away. Okay, so they implemented the system, and for a while it worked, right? There was no, they were detecting that boxes were empty, and the workers removed the boxes, and so all is well and good. Okay, and so they implemented the system and they stopped the empty boxes clearing. Right now, after a while, they realized that, hey, we're not getting any empty boxes, but for some reason, we are not detecting any empty boxes either. Right, so what's going on? Is it because the machine suddenly became perfect and assembled it properly, or did something else happen? And so the engineers thought, okay, let's go to the manufacturing line and talk to the operators to find out, like, has anything changed? So they went to talk to the operators, right? And they talk to them, oh, what's changed? And no, it's right. We're all working and it's all good. And then they realize, right, that there was a stand fan, right, that was near the manufacturing line, right? And the stand fan was not pointed at the worker, so it's not because of their comfort, right? But they realized it was pointing at the conveyor belt. So they asked the operator, oh, what's that stand fan there for, right? And the operator said, after a while, the alarm kept ringing in. We had to get up and go and pick up the box, right? So eventually we got sick and tired of it. We put the stand fan there, and the empty boxes were just blown away into a box, right? And so a stand fan solved the problem that hundreds of thousands of dollars, was spent to solve, right? And so really, at the end of the day, sometimes if we only look at it in terms of, we must design a very technical solution, right, and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we forget that sometimes a simple fix would actually solve the problem, right? So the reason why I'm bringing this story up is because I'm trying to illustrate the difference between an engineer's frame and a more holistic one, right? And also that the operators and the engineers, right, they were facing the same problem. They knew how the designs were like, they knew what the factory floor was like, right? But they came up with very different solutions because of the way they looked at the world, right? And this is a cautionary tale to a lot of engineers, right? That sometimes you got to work the factory floor with the operators so that you can understand, right, the practical solutions to a lot of the problems, right? And so just to illustrate, right, this is an issue of framing, right? So Eliab, going back to 1 Samuel chapter 17, right, he made the mistake of framing the issue as a soldier must be a soldier and a shepherd boy must be a shepherd boy. I'm a soldier, David's a shepherd boy. Let's not cross boundaries and let's not, step out of line, right? But he forgot to look at the big picture, right? The correct frame, or rather, the frame that David had was, regardless of whether I'm a soldier or a shepherd, we are all doing this for the glory of God, right? And so that's how David responded, regardless of whether he was a shepherd or not. And as we know further on, he didn't actually need to be a soldier to defeat Goliath in battle, because, like what his frame pointed to, the Lord was with him, right? And he said to himself, the Lord, help me to prevail against the lion and the bear, and he will help me to prevail against this giant, right? And that frame held true. Let's look at a different example, right, of framing. Let's go to Numbers chapter 13. We'll start with verse 17. Okay, and so some of us may be familiar with this story, right? So this is in Numbers, and this is long after they got out of Egypt and they were, going around in the wilderness, right? And Moses, knew that God promised the land of Canaan to them, right? And so imagine Moses, he had a bunch of people with him, like the whole children of Israel, a couple of million people, right? And before you move into an area which is inhabited by people that, may not want you to take their homes, right? He sent a bunch of spies, right, to go and scout out the land, to figure out, hey, number one, is it really a land of abundance? Is there enough resources? Later we go in and there's no water and there's no food and all that. So he sent them to go scout it out, but also to scout out the people that live there. Because if these people, do they have, are they very well equipped? Are they strong people? Do they have, powerful weapons that can, go against us and all that? And so verse 17, and Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, right? And said unto them, get you up this way southward and go up into the mountain and see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, right? And what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, right? Are they simple people that live in tents, or do they have castles and all that stuff? Right. So these 12 spies, right, were asked to go out into the land and bring back information about this place. Okay, let's fast forward to verse 27. Now these spies, they went out, they came back, and they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey. So this land is rich, milk and honey. It's a term when you use, there's a lot of abundance and all that, right? And this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. Right? And so trying to say that, it's no mean feat moving into this place. Now, and Caleb and Joshua were these two people, right? And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. So the rest of the spies had just said that, it's a tough place to take over. It's as if Caleb didn't hear them, right? Saying that, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land, though through which we have gone to search it, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. It's a very tough place, right? And all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature. And there we saw giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so were we in their sight. Right? So these people, they came back, and, I would imagine they would have been terrified. Right? What are you talking about? You want me to go into this place and conquer them? And these people are giants. I mean, we look like grasshoppers compared to them. Right? So I would imagine that these spies, right, they probably quite naturally had this response. You really can't blame them for having this response, right? They're essentially saying, yeah, the land is abundant, but we cannot conquer it because what, you want me to go fight giants, is it? Right? And so you could really say these spies had a pretty natural frame, right? They looked at it in terms of the logistics, they looked at it in terms of military tactics, and they realized, yeah, the enemy is stronger, right? Can't fault them for saying it, right? But let's go to Numbers 14, right? And let's see what Joshua and Caleb said. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes, right, as if in frustration, right? And they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us unto this land and give it to us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel ye not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. Right? Right. And so clearly this is a difference in framing, right? Because they were all sent out to spy on the land. They saw the same stuff. How is it that the interpretations were so different? Right? They all had access to the same land. They saw the land flowing with milk and honey, figuratively. They also saw the giants, right? But the framing of the 10 spies versus Joshua and Caleb were completely different, right? The 10 spies, they were weighing up whether they could conquer the land, right? Joshua and Caleb were weighing up whether the Lord could conquer the land, right? And the difference, and they knew the Lord could conquer the land. I mean, the Lord had took them out of in the Exodus, took them out of Egypt, right? Pillar of fire and pillar of cloud, and given them manna and all that cool stuff, right? And drowned the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, and so clearly they focused on God's promises, right? They weren't focused on giants and all that sort of stuff, and by like grasshoppers, right? They focused on the fact that the Lord had given them His promise, right? And the difference led to opposite conclusions. So the question here, after reading about all of this, right, is what about us? Right? What is our frame when we see the giant in our lives? Right? Sometimes a giant could be, what if I need to leave my job so that I can make the meetings regularly? Right? Or what if maybe not so much leave my job because everyone's got to work, but sometimes the job that we do prevents us from coming to the meetings. Right? What if speaking the truth will result in me losing something? I'm being intentionally brought here. But more often than not, we tend to be challenged at any point in our lives, right, with things like this. What if doing what is right according to the Lord is the more difficult option? Right? What if I cannot see a natural way that this would be easy? What if improving the situation, first requires me to humble myself and to change? This is often the biggest giant of all. Right? And so do we then go like 10 spies saying, it's too hard, it doesn't make sense to fight a losing battle? Right? I'm a grasshopper compared to this giant in my life. Right? Or do we then go, it is the right thing to do because God says it is the right thing to do, right? And doing the right thing, God will bless me through it. Right? So the question is, what is our frame, right, when it comes to things like that? Let's look at another instance of a difference in framing. Right? Let's go to Luke chapter 15. We'll start with verse 21. So this is the parable of the prodigal son. Right? And a lot of us will be quite familiar with this. Right? And I'm going to focus on the latter part, but just as a summary, right? We're talking about this rich man who had two sons. Right? And the younger son, he asked for his inheritance because I think he was bored, right? And went out into the world to spend it wastefully or prodigiously. Right? That's why I call him the prodigal son, because he was wasteful. Right? And then after he spent all his money, a famine hit, and the son struggled to eat. Right? a famine is like an economic crisis, right? Food becomes very expensive. You may not have enough. You will eat less, and so on, right? Like what's going on now with the Iran war and so on, right? And so he struggled to eat. He was hungry, right? And eventually, he realized that man, he ate the same stuff as the pigs, right? He really hit rock bottom because you would imagine pigs, they didn't even the Jews, right? To them pigs are unclean, right? They don't even go near it. But this guy, he had no choice. He had to eat the stuff that the pigs ate. So he really hit rock bottom. Right, eventually he went crawling back to his father and he repented. Right, let's start from verse 21 and see how he repented. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. I mean, he hit rock bottom, right? So what else can you say? But the father said unto his servants, Bring forth the best robe and put it on him. And put the ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring here the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Right, so complete 180. Right, this guy came in expecting to be probably worse than the servants. Right, and the father says, no, it's a celebration. It's a cause for celebration. Now his elder son, verse 25, was in the field, and he came and drew nigh into the house. He heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what happened. Right, and he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father has killed the fatted calf, because he had received him safe and sound. So the servant related what he heard. Right, verse 28. Now see what the older brother, and this is the focus of this example. And he was angry and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. And he answered, and he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. Whereas my younger brother, he wasted his inheritance, and now he comes back and you give him the fatted calf. Right, but as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed him for the fatted calf, killed for him the fatted calf. Now, immediately one of the things that I pick up when I read this, right, is in verse 30, it says, which hath devoured thy living with harlots. If you actually go back and you look at the beginning part of that scripture, it doesn't actually say he had harlots, right? It said riotous living, which means undisciplined or wasteful spending, right? Just like Eliab, right, the older brother, he accused the younger brother of doing things which he had no way of knowing, right? So was this pointing out a fact, or was this the anger in him speaking, right? And so in his anger, he added the details that he could not reasonably have known about. So the reason why I brought this up is because I want to compare the framing between the father and the older brother, right? And the framing for the older brother was, this guy, he left, he took the inheritance, he doesn't deserve to return because he blew it, right? But let's see what the father's frame is. Verse 31, and he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found. So clearly, two completely opposite outcomes. The older son's frame was this household. This household is made up of the wealth, the animals, the land, the house, and all the things that belong to the family, right? So that was his frame, right? The household comprises of all these material things. That's why when the son took the inheritance, the younger brother took the inheritance and left, it was a loss upon the family, right? So that was his frame. You have sinned against the household, right? The father's frame was completely the opposite, right? It's as if to say that my household is not made of my material things. It's made of my family, right? And my children, wealth or no wealth. And so when my younger son returns, it's not that I have lost the inheritance. It's that I have now gained my son again, right? So why would I not celebrate if my son returns, to the household. So the question here is, when we look at our walk, when we look at, everything, right? What is our focus? What is our frame? Right? Are we talking about building natural wealth? Right? Or are we talking about building our heart after what the Lord wants our heart to be? Right? Are we talking about, our brothers and sisters in the Lord? Or do we then just look at it in terms of, our contacts, our networking and all that? Because those two are very different frames. So the question here, right, the main question, right, is, what is our frame with regards to us being here? Right, man's frame is, we are here, because I go to church. I'm a Christian, so therefore I go to church. Right, man looks at church as a building or an organization. Right, so you often hear people say things like, "Oh, I'm a Christian, I go to church on Sundays." Right, when you actually dig into that statement, right, the definition of church in that statement is a building, because I go there on Sundays. I go to a building, right? Or the church is located at, like Pasir Panjang or something, right? Talking about that building that houses the people that go there to sing songs and to listen to a talk, right? Or the church, might be referred to as an organization, right? And where I go there and I meet nice people and they're all, lovey-dovey and nice to one another, right? And maybe I go there and listen to some talks that may teach me about life, right? But if that's our framing, that the church is an organization or even a building, right? When I go there and, when it takes me too long to go to the church, I'll go to a nearby one, right? If I go there and the people are not nice, I'm gone, right? Or if I go there and the pastor preaches something that makes me ashamed of what I'm doing, I don't feel good, so I'm gone, right? Because my frame of a church is a place that I go that, I can have a good social life and, all that stuff, right? But I'm not sure if that's the frame that the Lord expects of us, right? Because contrary to what we just talked about, right, the Lord's frame for what his church is supposed to be, it's not meant to be a building, right? The church is all the collective saints of the Lord around the world, right? So if we realize that, if that is actually our frame, right, then we will not say, I go to church on Sundays. What we'll actually say is, we are the church every day of the week, right? I am not in church. We are the church, right? Whether or not there is a meeting that's going on, right? Which is why when I first came to the Lord, I keep hearing, oh, why is it we don't say we go to church? We say we go to the meetings. I realized then, right, that the meeting is the gathering of the saints who are the church, right? And so, once we have the right framing, the vocabulary even falls into place, right? We start to refer to it correctly then, right? And once we have the right framing, we then start to see from God's perspective, and we also realize what we need to do once we have the right framing. So, for example, instead of coming to the meetings to mark attendance so I can get more blessings, right? Instead of marking attendance, we come to the meetings because we want to be encouraged and we want to encourage, right? And having the right frame, you go then not just to receive, but also not just to receive material things, but you are going there to receive and give spiritually, right? Instead of reading the scriptures only because I'm attending a talk and the talk and the speaker wants me to refer to Luke chapter 15, verse 21, therefore I know about the scripture, right? If we have the right frame, we will then look at it very differently, right? Instead of just reading the scriptures because I'm supposed to read it during a talk, I want to learn about the scriptures so that I can act on it and so that it will improve my walk with the Lord and my life, right? The focus then is not reading because of obligation, but reading because it actually brings me benefit, right? And I could go on, right? Instead of witnessing to people because my pastor says I should, I witness to people because I want to see them saved, So let's go back. 1 Samuel chapter 17 to round off. Verse 28. And Eliab, his eldest brother, we're reading this again, yeah? And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why have you come down? Or why camest thou down hither? Right? And so Eliab's question was framed as an accusation. Right? Why are you here? What business do you have here? But we really do have to ask ourselves that question. Right? Not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine question. Right? Because the answer here will determine the answer will point very strongly to how we go about our walks. Right? And I guess will be a very powerful predictor of how we will end up when the Lord returns. So the real question, right, is why am I really here? Right? Am I in the church as an organization, or am I in the church as a body of Christ? Right? Why do I come for the meetings? Why do I have fellowship? Why do I do all these things? Right? Because the difference between the framings that we have in the response to this question, it can mean the difference between readying myself for the Lord's return such that I make it when he returns versus wasting my time completely. Right? Because if I'm not looking at it with the correct frame, then nothing I do will help my walk. Right? And when the Lord returns, just like what we heard in the gifts today, many will say, Lord, when he returns, have I not done all of these things in your name? And he will look at us and say, I know you not. Depart from me, you who work iniquity. Right? We also heard that gift earlier on, right? Talking about our perspective, right? And so if our perspective, right, of coming to the church is so that I can benefit myself, we look for, let's say I only come to church because I want a healing, or let's say I come to church because I want to find a job, whatever, some blessing, right? Then are we looking at God as an ATM machine or an ATM, right? Because if we look at it in the material frame, right, a blessing is whatever is better for me. Whereas if I look at it, in the frame of building my relationship with God, then a blessing is anything that brings me closer to God. Right? And so depending on the perspective that we have, right, we would ready ourselves for the Lord's return, or we would be wasting our time. I might as well just do something else on Sundays, right? It's a whole day, one day out of 7 days in a week, right? So in summary, right, this whole talk we examined a few examples, right, to cover the differences in framing between a whole bunch of people. The first example was Eliab and David, right, which is the subject of the theme for the next 2 months, right? One was focused on overstepping boundaries, right, and the other was focused on God's honor, regardless of whether or not he was a soldier to fight Goliath, right? The other one was the 10 spies and Caleb and Joshua, right? The 10 focus on the natural difficulty of conquering the land. The 2 weren't interested in the logistics. They were focused on God's promises, right? And we're talking about the older brother and the father of the prodigal son, right? To the brother, the household was the wealth and the inheritance, right? To the father, the household was his sons, right? And so really the big question that we need to ask ourselves today is, what is the frame that we've got, right, when we walk our walk, right? And maybe the real question to be asking us is, why am I really here? And so this is just a few things to think about, and I guess that will be a start to the theme that we will have for the next 2 months, and I'll leave it there.